Well, welcome everybody. You are muted, so we cannot hear you. You will be muted for most of the presentation today. I am Jennifer De Leon. I am Director of Justice for Women of the ELCA. And on behalf of Women of the ELCA and ELCA Advocacy, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. We will get started promptly at 5 Eastern Standard Time, 4 Central Standard Time, and wherever that standard time, whatever time that is where you're at. We want to go over some basic housekeeping items so that we are all on the same page on today's webinar. We're very glad that you are here. As I said in the beginning, all of your lines are muted to avoid audio issues. Please let us know through the chat box if you can hear me. So you might see a couple of boxes. One says question and answers, one says chat. We want to ask you all to ensure that you're using the box, the chat only, and that when you go to it, on the bottom you can toggle or you can click on it and it'll say all panelists or all panelists and attendees. Make sure that you click on where it says all panelists and attendees so we can all see your questions and we can help you. Lisa Plorine, I see you say you hear me. Thank you for joining. The other people can let us know if you can hear me. That way we can make sure that our audio is adjusted correctly and we can all be participating together. So I'm gonna wait a few more seconds. Hopefully some of you all who are listening can let us know if you can hear us. You can put it in the chat. So don't be shy. Okay, Lynette Todd, you hear us. Thank you so much for joining. So we'll get started, like I said, at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We've scheduled this to be an hour. We want to honor everyone's time. We know many of us are Zoom fatigued and we're on multiple webinars and meetings virtually, and a lot of you are now doing homeschooling, so we don't want to take up too much of your time with this very important information that we want to share with you. And we want to ensure at the end that there will be an opportunity for question and answers. Again, I want you to take a look if you haven't been on a webinar via Zoom. There is a section that says question and answers. Do not use that. Use the section that says chat, and that's where we'll be able to monitor your questions and any information you want to share with us. And also, as I mentioned in the chat section, there's a little menu when you toggle or put your cursor over it that allows you to either write to the panelists or panelists and participants. We're going to ask you to please use the one that says panelists and participants. As I said, in a few minutes, we will also be streaming this via Facebook Live on the Women of the ELCA Facebook page, and I think also on the ELCA Advocacy Facebook page. This is being recorded. We want to let you know that this will be recorded. Your cameras are all off, so we cannot see you. So we really want you to sit back, relax, and enjoy. But more importantly, be ready to ask us questions and make sure that that you know that we were trying our best to give you vital information. This will be recorded, and those of you that registered via Zoom, you will get a follow-up email that will include the information that's being presented today. So you don't have to worry about scribbling down any of the statistics we give out or any of the websites. We'll also be putting those throughout the webinar in our chat section. James Williams, you can hear us. Thank you. I see who else is on here. Annette Todd. So again, I want to ask you to click down to when you chat where it says all panelists and attendees. So just make sure that you're doing that so everybody can see you. Okay, well, we are going to get started. As I said, my name is Jennifer De Leon. I am the Director of ELCA. I'm the Director of Justice for Women of the ELCA. And we want to welcome you here for today for our webinar. And want to remind you all that you are muted and that we are recording this and we don't see you. I know some of you might have just, I see you're getting on now. And please use the chat box for question and answers. And there will be a time at the end where we will have question and answers that we will be going over. Before we start, I think we're going to start with a prayer that I want to offer to you all, and then we will introduce today's panelists. So you all join me for a moment of prayer. Creator God, grant us the gift of understanding. Help us to understand the feelings of others, the lives that others are living and what they're going through, the desires of others, and the goals of everyone that we are in community with, and those who we don't know that are in our communities. At the same time, help me Help us to understand ourselves, our actions, and our reactions. Widen our vision beyond our own world and our own community. Widen our vision so we can embrace with knowledge the love and the worlds and the experiences of others. We ask this in your name. Amen. Today's presentation will be a joint presentation by women of the ELCA and our partners in ministry, ELCA Advocacy. Our presenters today, our panelists, will include the Reverend Amy Ruman, who is the Director of ELCA Advocacy, Regina Banks, Director of Lutheran Office of Public Policy, California, and she is also on the board of the Women's Synodical Organization for Sierra Pacific, welcome. We have the Reverend Cindy Crane. She is Director of Lutheran Office for Public Policy in Wisconsin, and Taina Diaz-Reyes, who is an ELCA Hunger Advocacy Fellow. Not listed here is Karen Kruger, who is going to be helping us. She is the Program Director for Advanced Advocacy Engagement for ELCA Advocacy. And where it says Women of the ELCA, we have the Executive Director of Women of the ELCA, Linda Poshposhkaski, who is serving as our tech support and all behind the support in this endeavor. So thank you all for joining us. We're going to start today with the theological grounding, as the work that we do is grounded in our ministry and our faith. And so we're going to start with that as our foundation. And I'd like to introduce now, we're going to turn it over to Amy Ruman and Taina Diaz.
Good afternoon, and thank you to Women of the ELCA, especially to Linda and Jen for their partnership, not just in putting together this webinar, but for all of your stalwart commitment to justice and advocacy and your leadership together. And greetings to everyone on the call in this election year as we move forward together as a church, civically engaged and preserving the right to vote. Our theme today is, why does your vote matter and how does it matter, especially in this year? We all know the right to vote. It's foundational in our democracy, and it's an attribute of citizenship. It matters because as stewards of the order that God has made, it's one way we steward our life together as a nation. It's one way that we care for our neighbor, and it's a way that we promote the common good, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. But it's not something we think about a lot in our church lives. It's not something we talk about enough in our Bible studies or hear mentioned from the pulpit, except maybe every 4 years right now in the run-up to a presidential election. So today we're gathering to affirm our votes do matter, and that we also have to work to make every vote count. In recent years, we've seen increasing attacks on the integrity of the electoral system, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. We've seen active disinformation campaigns. We've seen foreign interference, and these and more have weakened our overall infrastructure and cast doubt upon the results coming up in November for some. And now we're also seeing repeated attempts through propaganda and other means to further undermine our system and discredit the results of the 2020 election in advance. So we have work to do. But first, let's go back to some of our own foundations, just to 2013, where some of you may remember that the ELCA Churchwide Assembly adopted a social policy resolution titled Voting Rights to All Citizens. And this resolution calls on members, congregations, and synods to, quote, promote public life worthy of the name. Don't you love that? Promote public life worthy of the name by speaking out as advocates and engaging in local efforts such as voter registration and supporting legislation to guarantee the right to vote for all. This, of course, is not the first time our church has encouraged civic engagement, but this was a forceful statement, not only about the importance of the vote, but also an affirmation of the clear and present threats to voting rights, and a call to our church that continues to sound to us just these few years later for greater engagement, not just in the run-up to the election day for the few weeks in advance, not just by doing voter registration drives or going to the polls for now through November 3rd, but every single day after that as well. The ELCAVotes initiative was born out of the passage of that resolution just in time for the 2016 election. It was a partnership, and it still is, of ELCA Advocacy, of ELCA Racial Justice, and ELCA Young Adults, because we recognize as a church that voting is a theological issue, because when we do so, we recognize the image of God in every person and the value of each human being so that everyone must have a voice. We recognize that there are justice issues related to voting, particularly around racial justice, and that the leadership of young adults is essential in our outreach and voter education, and advocacy is needed to dismantle the systems and laws that perpetuate disenfranchisement. We know voter suppression is real. Voting in our nation was first enshrined only for educated white men who own property. It took more than a century for access to the ballot to meaningfully begin to expand to people of color, to women, to people with disabilities, to people who are low income, and to American Indians and Alaska Natives. Through the history of voter suppression from the Jim Crow era of the 19th to the 21st century, and our current climate of restrictive voter laws, where many people, particularly people of color, face ongoing barriers and obstacles to their right to vote. So as a church committed to racial justice, we have a responsibility to challenge and remove these barriers, particularly in the communities that have historically been the most disenfranchised. As a church committed to human dignity, we have to reaffirm and promote voting, not just as a constitutional right, but another way that we honor the image of God in all people. And we have to get clear about our public witness as a church at this time, which is why we're here today. And so I'd like to invite in Taina Diaz-Reyes, our Hunger Advocacy Fellow in the DC Advocacy Office, to talk about some of the new foundations for this work. Taina?
Thank you, Amy. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. Like Amy said, I'm Taina Diaz-Reyes. I am the Hunger Advocacy Fellow at the Advocacy Office in DC. I started at the beginning of September and will be sticking around until next August. I'm hoping to learn more about advocacy strategy and communications, as well as leading an advocacy strategy and communications. This fellowship provides me with experience in doing advocacy on important issues that are passions of mine, like hunger, food security, and sustainability, and promoting racial equity and policy related to those issues. More importantly, I'm learning how to do advocacy from a faith-based lens, using theological language and an ecclesial approach. I know that's a lot of Christianese language, but that really is what drew me to this position, to this work. And so I want to start by asking a few questions that will ground us to hear the following questions from a lens of, from the lens of the oppressed. How long, so these are questions you're asking yourself, how long have people like me had the right to vote? Do my elected representatives look like me? Am I afraid of what will happen if I do not vote in this election? Am I concerned about how my life will be affected if one or the other candidate is elected to public office? Have I ever felt there was someone who didn't want me to vote? If anything, my hope in asking these questions is to make you think about the reality of voter suppression and intimidation and the need for an ecclesial response to these realities. In the present time, these realities are taking on different forms and may be enacted by different people than they have in the past. So what does it mean for you or me as Lutherans to be involved in public life? Frankly, it involves addressing voting and voting rights. The ELCA's newest social message, Government and Civic Engagement in the United States, Discipleship in a Democracy, expresses the Lutheran perspective on the Lutheran perspective on what it means to be involved in public life, including addressing voting and voting rights. The document expressly names the importance of principles like unrestricted participation in political messages, in political process, and the consent of the governed. Utilizing the Church's social statements and social messages, the ELCA advocacy offices support Lutherans in living out our call to civic engagement. Our stances are based upon the Church's social statements and messages that delineate the Church's role in public life, including promoting the Lutheran call to service, justice, and dedication to the well-being of our neighbor. For example, we seek unrestricted participation in political process, meaning we believe in protecting eligible voters from being excluded from the political process, like voting in elections. I think it's important that in today's world, facing the election that we need to prepare to face potential challenges to voters of color who go to the polls or want to place their ballot in their local ballot boxes, because these tensions present in the political arena and in our communities along lines of ideology and color present a different kind of suppression. I am particularly concerned because voter suppression intentionally targets Black and brown people in attempts to prevent them from exercising their right to vote. See voter ID laws, gerrymandering, and voter registration prohibitions, like requiring people to have a street address when registering to vote. Today, we are faced with the possibility of violent suppression at the physical polls and ballot boxes themselves. For us to give our consent to be governed means we expect that our government protects our neighbors' freedom and the right to live life without imposed restrictions, barring them from participating in our country's political process. As the social message on government and civic engagement asserts, so many in our history have been denied the right to vote. And so we were governed without consent. Thus, we are called to evaluate how well agencies of government are doing their proper work of providing for the safety and well-being of those within the country by asking the question, is the neighbor being served? Are we ensuring that our neighbor is being served, their rights protected, their experience to exercise the right to vote is a safe one? Is our action in advocating for their rights an expression of following Jesus' command to love our neighbor as ourselves? Wouldn't you want someone to do so for you? Isn't that what we expect when we participate in our political process? Let us have faith in our God, a God who preserves our lives and our freedom, granting us his image and therefore an inherent dignity that governmental abuse of power cannot suppress or intimidate. Amen. So our next portion is to ask what is at stake in this election. For me, I want to reframe the question and ask what is at stake in this election for myself and my ethnic or racial communities, my age demographic, and other female identifying persons. For my Latinx and Indigenous communities, our well-being is at risk because of both policy and political indifference to our values and experiences. What happens when we are not engaged in this country's political process? What happens when our voices and our votes are not acknowledged as essential parts of the political process? What happens when we truly understand that we are the ones who give consent to be governed, electing those we think will do the most justice to the job of governing? When our votes are suppressed, when voters are intimidated into not voting, when our lives are deemed less valuable than others, our lives are intimately and painfully impacted by the right to vote that others are not only allowed to exercise, but encouraged to exercise, others with certain kinds of privileges. So what do I mean by this? I mean that candidates, campaigns, and representatives in office are not actively trying to connect with us and the things that matter in our lives. So what's at stake? What's at stake for me in this election? I cannot think in that individualistic way. Am I affected by the candidates and measures on the ballot? Absolutely. But when I stand at the polling place, when I submit my mail-in ballot, I am voting for people in my communities who cannot vote because for one reason or another, their voices don't have a role in our political process. Some are simply not US citizens, like undocumented migrants or permanent residents who are living in this country but are unable to vote in national elections. Some are children, they're minors who have to suffer the consequences of the choices those of voting age make or of their families and communities not voting. So many whose lives are affected in many ways more intensely and directly than my own by who is elected to power. Their jobs are at stake, their health and safety at stake, their education, their ability to acquire loans, their social and communal welfare. All of these things are at stake. If I simply choose not to vote, or if I choose to vote for candidates that suggest or support oppressive measures, then things like the suppression of our languages happen. The attempt to define us without our consultation or consent as Hispanic on the census happens. Continuing to exclude us during the proposed changes to the 2020 census happens. Separation of families, the death, illness, and assault enacted against migrant detainees happens. Trying to ban teaching children the history of this country or banning Chicano or Mexican American studies in schools happens. The use of immigrants as scapegoats and other tools of rhetoric happens. How much of our country's history occurred because our voices and votes were suppressed? Our opportunity to be advocates for our own lives and communities is at hand, and I intend to take full advantage of that. Now on to Amy, as she answers the question, what is at stake?
Thank you, Taina, for bringing the particularities of your full identity to bear to that question, but also helping us think about that when we vote, we do so for the community, and sometimes communities who we may not know yet, and considering the well-being of our neighbor across the country when we step into that booth. For myself, think about, for those of you who have voted before, the first time you voted. The first time I voted was in 1981. And I can still remember how excited I was and how the heavy sense of responsibility I felt when I first stepped into a voting booth. I actually couldn't figure out how to pull the lever and had to ask a poll worker for help. So I was a little humbled at the end of that. Years later, I started taking my own young children to vote with me because I wanted them to see and appreciate the right and the duty we have to show up and cast our vote because they matter. And I remember how my young daughter proudly wore her "I voted" sticker all the rest of the day. Now, most election years, we hear pundits pronounce that this is the most important election of our lifetimes. Maybe it's the next election is always the most important one. But this year, this seems a particularly apt description because we are facing new challenges, and so we have to be extra prepared. First of all, we are conducting an election during a global pandemic, as we all well know. It's already affected the availability of polling places and the availability of poll workers to staff those places. Voting by mail, a formerly routine and unremarkable way to cast your ballot, has now become heavily politicized. Its very legitimacy cast into doubt and distorted with confusing information about how to vote being circulated from the highest levels. Misinformation, including by foreign actors, as well as homegrown sources, are creating confusion and further divisions. The integrity of the process is at stake in ways we have never seen before, and we'll hear more from our next speakers about what to do in these situations. Our votes matter, so that the role of the faith community also really matters right now in how we show up. This is a year to dust off that 2013 resolution and our new social message and affirm that our voting and civic engagement work has to happen not every 4 years, but as communities of color, as the disability community and many others have known, this has to be daily work that goes on in the years in between and the time between elections, and that daily vigilance is required. What's at stake in this election is that the church has been invited to lead in some new ways to contribute to our national life. Our votes matter so that we have to share that everyone this year needs a voting plan. How, when, and where. And to make sure that you have accurate information about mail-in ballots, about early voting, about safety measures for voting in person. And not only do you need a plan to vote, you need a backup plan to vote if the first one doesn't work. And if you are set, you need to talk to your family and neighbors and congregation about their need to plan. Our votes matter, so we also need to become aware that there is no longer such a thing as election day or an election night where those who choose to stay up into the wee hours are going to know the results. This year we're looking at election week, or months even, before every race may be settled. And we need to share and prepare our communities for that eventuality. The church and you as leaders are often trusted messengers in your communities. And so we who know and value the truth of Christ need to also be tellers of truth in a divided and confusing time, which means determining trustworthy sources of information in advance and then in making plans to share that trustworthy advice. We also need to exercise public leadership and be ready to speak to and counter when officials or the media or others make bad faith or unsubstantiated claims about rigging or stealing an election. We also need to insist that every single vote be counted and to support our local officials in taking the time they need, even when it takes longer than usual. And finally, we do need to be prepared for the potential for unrest or violence. either as election results are delayed or when the final results are announced. And this unrest could come from many, many different quarters. We have some time to prepare now about how our congregations and leaders can be present, who our partners are, and what kind of training, witness, or mobilization might be needed. And as always, we have the power of prayer, and I'm delighted that ELCA Worship has created some new resources for prayer in an election season, which we will send you the links to after this webinar. Bishop Eaton has also just released today, a new video on civic engagement to also guide and encourage the church at this time that we will play.
There we go.
A churchwide assembly adopted a social policy resolution titled Voting Rights to All Citizens. This resolution calls on members, congregations, and synods of this church to promote public life worthy of the name by speaking out as advocates and engaging in local efforts such as voter registration and supporting legislation to guarantee the right to vote to all citizens. This year, we are voting during a pandemic and during a time when some seek to cast doubt upon the security of our voting process. We, our people, congregations, and synods can help. We can disseminate accurate information about how and when to vote in our states. We can encourage people to make a personal voting plan and a backup voting plan. Our congregations can serve as polling places, and we can explain why early voting is important and also makes us safer. And we need to remain calm. Because of the pandemic, more are voting by mail. We must prepare as a nation for delayed results. Luther's understanding of Christian freedom is that we are freed in Christ to serve the neighbor. Guaranteeing our neighbor's right to vote and to participate fully and freely in society is a way to serve the neighbor. Please visit the link below for information and resources about civic engagement. In this country, we vote. That's what we do. This country has a long and proud history of honoring the vote and having a peaceful and orderly transfer of power. That's who we are.
Thank you, Bishop Eaton, in absentia. And I would now like to invite my colleague, the Reverend Cindy Crane, who is Director of the Lutheran Office of Public Policy in Wisconsin, to speak about misinformation.
Great, thank you, Amy and Jen, for having me here with you today. So I want to talk about misinformation and how it creates problems, either when it is intentional, an intentional form of voter suppression, which it is, or misinformation that's passed on innocently. So the problem of the spread of misinformation during political campaigns has been around since I can remember, which is a long time, and long before that. But as we know, social media has heightened our ability to spread solid information as well as false information, not only about candidates, but about voting. So some people may have concerns about Russian interference again, both sides of the political aisle claiming that Russia is against them. But the only thing anyone trying to exert foreign influence has to do is repeat all the fake news already out there. The biggest threat to a fair election may be from Americans spreading mistruths about mail-in balloting and misinformation in the wake of possibly delayed election results. And there is a lot of misinformation about the legitimacy of the vote. So, true or false, mail-in ballots will lead to a rigged election, and they are substantially fraudulent. That's a quote. And that is false. When referring to mail-in ballots, your democracy, your freedom is being stripped away from you. And if you allow that, then everything this country stood for, fought for, bled for is in vain. Wow, that's very dramatic. And it's also false. There's nothing to substantiate that. And yet, these kinds of statements are being seen by millions of people via social media. These ads seem created to tap into existing anxiety about the integrity of the voting system and to convince voters in the midst of this pandemic to not trust in the various ways there are to legally vote, or could discourage people from voting altogether. So making false claims about voting is a new form of voter suppression. In the documentary Social Dilemma, we learned that fake news is clicked onto 6 times more frequently than real news. The goal of social media is to get clicks, not to offer the most beneficial information. Algorithms tap into our interests and political leanings and other leanings, and then sensationalize headlines and memes, drawing us into clicking. As a result, conspiracy theories and hate campaigns have recently grown via the internet in ways that have disrupted entire nations. Fake news about voting has also been rampant. So it is true that there have been budget cuts to the Postal Service, and there have been delays. During the spring primary, states that normally weren't used to having so many absentee ballots come in experienced some problems. States accustomed to mail-in voting as a norm had different stories. So the Postal Service claims to be ready, especially if no workers are cut or if more are added. So I took precaution by mailing my absentee ballot in early. And you can track whether your ballot has arrived or not. And if it hasn't, you can talk to your clerk about it. So a key way to fight voter suppression is to get the right information out there. And there are misinformation campaigns, and then there is the problem of simply trying to get the right information for your state and municipality because laws may have changed or people give us unhelpful information innocently. So for example, there are different ways to deliver your absentee ballot in some states, but not all. You might think that you're able to deliver your absentee ballot in person to your polling place on election day because your friend in the next city did that. But yours might be different. Maybe in your city, you need to take it to a central location. And some states may not allow you to do anything at all with your absentee ballot except mail it in. Another example is in Wisconsin, there is no law against having another person deliver your absentee ballot on election day or to a polling place or to a central location, depending on your city. But another state might have a law that doesn't allow that. Or you might not have the right information about what you need to register to vote or to vote on election day. Also, we just interviewed somebody from the Wisconsin Elections Commission, and he warned that at least in this state, a lot of people are getting texts and calls, emails telling them they're not registered or their absentee ballot hasn't been received. These might even be innocent groups trying to help. He said, ignore them. And if you have questions, contact your local clerk. So to ensure you have the right information, it's best to check with your local clerk. And if you don't have that information, there'll be a slide up later with this web address, but you can go to usa.gov/voting. So solutions to counter misinformation. First of all, knowing where to go in your state or municipality to get the best information is part of it. And also you may have a statewide elections commission on your statewide and municipal websites, and you can look for any information that's easy to share in social media. And then we're talking about making a plan for voting. How about making a plan for spreading good, solid information? Once or twice a week leading up to the election, consider countering a couple pieces of misinformation or just giving some important deadlines. You can do this as a church, as a women of the ELCA group, another organization, as a family, or as an individual. And you could also get other people involved, making short videos, etc. So there's also a great piece, there's a great resource that the ELCA Advocacy Office is putting out calling Sifting Through Misinformation, and that is highlighting the Episcopal Church resources. So we all need to be alert to misinformation for ourselves, and please consider finding and sharing correct information to combat simple misconceptions and voter suppression that is quite intentional in your communities and states. Thank you so much, and I'm going to hand it off to Regina now.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Regina Banks, and I am the director of the Lutheran Office of Public Policy, California. And I am here to talk to you about Get Out the Vote, this time that we're in now. The conventions have all convened. The speeches have all been given. Dear Lord, the TV ads are almost over. We're in the home stretch. And as someone who's worked on a lot of campaigns, I can tell you this is the scariest time of any campaign, the Get Out the Vote. And it's scary, and it's a scary time even in the best of political climates. A lot of time and money has been invested in getting you and me, the average voter, to recognize the name of a candidate or differentiate Proposition 16, that's about affirmative action, from Proposition 25, that's about bail reform. And now all those campaigns can do is hope that the people that they've convinced to think their way, one, turn in a ballot, and two, that ballot gets counted. And this year, those two pieces are more perilous than ever. Number one, turn in your ballot. There are 50 states and nearly that many permutations of how to vote this year. So the most important thing I can tell you this afternoon is to find out the rules in your state and follow them to the letter. 35 states have made fear of COVID-19 a valid reason to request a mail-in ballot. If you live in one of those states and you have not already requested your mail-in ballot, your only task for the rest of the whole day is to request that ballot. Go to your state's Secretary of State website and request a mail-in ballot the instant you're off this webinar. If you're fiddling on your smartphone right now, you can probably do it while you keep listening to me. Stop and request your mail-in ballot. Delays in the US Postal Service are simply not a variable we want to play games with this year. 9 states automatically mail out ballots. California is one of them. This is my ballot. It arrived last night. It won't spend the weekend in this house. I live with other voting adults. Their ballots arrived yesterday too. Their ballots won't spend the weekend in this house. My point is that if you live in one of the 9 states that automatically mail a ballot to everyone, you likely have your ballot already and will by the end of the week. It is legal and permissible to fill it out, sign it, and mail it back. However, strongly consider filling out your ballot, signing it, and taking it to your county voter registration office. Missing signatures are the #1 reason that a mail-in ballot is rejected. Also, check the date. That's also a common cause for rejection. It's the date that you signed it, not the date of the election. And taking it to your county board, your board of voter registration and elections as soon as possible. Only about 6 states have standard universal mail-in voting. Those states have built out the infrastructure needed to verify, sort, and count a deluge of ballots in a day or two. Let's help the other states by flattening the curve of when mail-in ballots arrive. And even if you live in a state where it's permissible to have someone else drop off your mail-in votes, do not give your ballot to someone that you do not know to return. But Regina, I just love waiting in line and voting in those little booths. Well, okay. But we've got some advice for you as well. 1, wear a mask and all of the protective equipment required by your local laws and that make you feel safe. 2, pack a lunch. At least 7 states have reported closing precincts, particularly in urban areas. 3, consider going in groups or at least in pairs. It helps the time go by faster, but studies have shown that single voters are more likely to have their right to vote questioned. 4, if you're in line by the time the polls close, you can vote. Don't be told otherwise. 5, don't be dissuaded from voting. This is a hard one because I can't guess all of the ways that someone may try to talk you out of voting before you leave. While it's a federal violation to participate in voter intimidation of any kind, voter suppression remains a concern, especially in historically disenfranchised communities. This will be the first federal election in 40 years that the GOP is no longer under a consent decree to refrain from hiring off-duty police officers and others to try to intimidate voters. There is no valid police force that can ask for ID or any other information before you have reached the balloting area. Don't be dissuaded. Whether you vote by mail or at the polls, you will get a ticket that allows you to track your ballot. After the election, check to be certain that your vote was counted. If it was not, contact your Secretary of State as soon as possible. I know you're tired of this election. I know I am exhausted, but it's the home stretch where this process will succeed or fail. We cannot grow weary now. Stay vigilant, not just until November 3rd, but until January 20th, and then every day after that. And now I will turn it over to our moderator.
I'm sorry, can I get the camera back on? So now we're going to go over just sharing some information that we have with, as you see, we've been putting them in the chat. We're going to just go through the slides. And I'm going to just go through some of these. As you can see, vote.gov is a useful place to start, especially when you connect with state-specific information. As you heard all our panelists talk to, it's important to make sure we have the correct information specifically to our state, to our area, so making sure that we have all that information so that we are not only are we doing what we're supposed to be doing, we're not also participating in the misinformation or the spreading of misinformation. I think the next slide talks about other resources that we have, and I'm going to now invite Karen Kruger, the Director for Advocacy and Engagement for the ELCA, who is going advocacy, is going to talk to us about some of these other wonderful resources that we have prepared for you all.
Yeah, I'm glad to do that. I wanted to share with you, the slide will probably make it easiest to see, but there's a really wonderful new resource that just was released from women of the ELCA. There it is, called Call to Be Political, and it's a study tool you can use by yourself or in groups, and it's an update from a previous edition with a lot of refreshed information that kind of asks questions about where you're at, and to me, it asked questions about where some of my questions were and guided me in the process. It's a wonderful resource. And we also have a number of things from the ELCA Advocacy Office. And information comes in a couple different places, so I just wanted to highlight what some of those are. ELCA.org/votes includes things like Bible studies. The most recent one is called Suffering and Rejoicing. And there's even very specific information like a voter guidelines for persons experiencing homelessness and how you might be able to make sure those people are enfranchised as well, or those of us who are homeless enfranchised as well. ELCA.org/civic engagement is the URL that Bishop Eaton shared, and that's where you'll find really basic tools like the ELCA Civic Engagement Guide with tip sheets for get out the vote drives and registration drives, and all sorts of information, including guidance for churches and clergy participating in the electoral process. Our ELCA advocacy blog is able to be a little more flexible with up-to-the-minute information, and that's where the sifting through misinformation piece is located, as well as a lot of different blog posts, including churches as polling places. And you'll find us on social media at ELCA Advocacy on Facebook, Twitter, and on Instagram. A lot of you are located in places with state public policy offices, and if you're curious about that network, we have a map and a list of those locations on our resource page, which is elca.org/resources/advocacy. And I will also highlight for you that you're always welcome to be part of the ELCA Advocacy Network by signing up, and you'll receive updates every month, as well as action alerts when it's a good time to make a difference. And that you can access from elca.org/advocacy/signup. And those buttons are always popular. So if somebody wants to order the buttons, just take a look for those at oldlutheran.com. Happy to answer any questions too. Contact us at washingtonoffice@elca.org and we'd be glad to respond, in addition to our colleagues here from the Women of the ELCA.
Thank you. Before we go into our question and answer time, we just want to share with you, this is something Regina shared with us yesterday when we were preparing for this. We know that everyone who's on here, we're assuming best intentions. We assume that anybody who would take time to be here at the end of their day, most of us at the end of the day, intends to follow Christ. No need to preface any statements or questions. Just keep in mind that we'll always be biased. Everyone has a bias. This is not a bad thing. The mere fact of your bias is not offensive. Don't take offense at others' bias. The devil doesn't need an advocate. You must own your own unease. So if you're going to ask a question or pose, make sure that we think about that. Policy is in politics. Policy does not equal politics, but they do travel in the same circles. It's not practical to think you'll engage in one without the other. Just be mindful. Having said all that, then we're going to give a few minutes for you to pose any questions you might have in the chat, and we will do our best to answer them. And I'm looking to see if we have any questions in our chat. If not, I also want to, another resource is always, you can go to the Women of the ELCA website, www.womenoftheelca.org. We are now going to also have a series, cafe, Bold Cafe is our, one of our publications, and we're going to be having cafe dinners by Beth McBride, who is our intergenerational staff person and also does communications for us. I'm putting the link in there. And one of the resources that was shared, the first one is called To Be Political. The writers that help put that together, some of them will be on Wednesday evening to discuss a little bit more in depth how we can use this resource. So I put the link there. If you have a better one, Beth, you can pop it in the chat. And I will now see if there's any questions. So I think I want to thank our panelists, and they did an amazing job. Everything is crystal clear. Everyone knows where to go vote, how to go vote. There are no questions. I'm not seeing any questions, and we're going to remind everyone to use the chat for questions, not the question and answer on the webinar.
Jen, we did have one question that was asked.
Oh, should we expect all votes to be counted within a week? I think Amy alluded to that, but I think Regina, you want to answer that one?
I can definitely tell you that even just the County of Sacramento is saying that it'll probably be sometime in early December when we'll have complete counts. So the answer to that is no.
So I think unless, and excuse me, I don't have my glasses on in the chat small. It seems a lot of questions around the turnaround of votes and contesting and how is that going to work. So Amy, you got on if you have any information on that, or Cindy?
I'm just going to drop in the chat. I found a really helpful source, Ballotpedia, and there's different places where you can find this out, but states count absentee and mail-in ballots very differently. And some cannot start counting them before Election Day. Some are already counting them, and there's a whole patchwork. And so that's also going to contribute to some of the uncertainty and unknowns because it's just going to look, you know, one state may be all done, right? And then their neighboring state, you know, they've got 1 million unresolved races. And I think that will also help heighten the uncertainty when people aren't aware that each state has different statutes.
Yeah, thank you. And we just interviewed someone from the Wisconsin Elections Commission, as I mentioned, with the Lutheran Office for Public Policy in Wisconsin. And he was asked that question, and he said that in Wisconsin, you can't start counting until 7 a.m. the day of the elections, as you mentioned, Amy, and there's been advocacy around changing that, but it has not. And he also said that in counties that are small, that probably on Election Day, all of the votes will be counted, but not in Madison or Milwaukee or Green Bay. They all may be counted within a week, but again, it's going to vary according to state. But that shouldn't. I'm really reiterating some of what you said, Amy, but you know, fear over this has been used to stoke anxiety about the elections too. and it doesn't need to.
Thank you for that, Cindy. And again, as you heard some of the panelists earlier mention that if you are available on election day to go and help out and make sure and ensure people aren't being turned away from the polls, make sure you know what are the rules in your specific state. What can you do if you see someone being turned away from the polls, disenfranchised? I know Regina yesterday mentioned that specific language that and ways you can identify if someone's blocking you from voting and that you should call and report that. I normally take the day off and I go into suburbs in the Chicago area where folks sometimes don't speak English as their first language. And I make sure that I'm a witness and I help people if they need help finding out. In the state of Illinois, you do not need to have an ID. You don't need to present an ID to vote. You need to make sure you're in the rolls. And sometimes we've seen people insist that people voting have to have an ID. And once someone advocates or speaks in and knows the language or knows, the process, then the people who are trying to suppress votes right away realize that there's an advocate, there's someone they're watching. And so that's one of the things that we can do. I know a lot of us are worried about the turnaround of the votes in the county, but I'm more worried about voter suppression.
And there's one thing I should have mentioned, and I'm disappointed in myself for having not said this. If you get to on the day of the election and you get to the polling place and they say, your name is not on the rolls, you can't vote, ask for a provisional ballot, vote provisionally, and then fight it later and call the Secretary of State's office and begin that fight. But don't leave before you voted at least provisionally, because after election day, there's nothing you can say about it.
I see a question from Valora Star. What is the process to become a poll observer? If any of you can mention that, but I know here in Illinois, I work with our local, the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant Refugee Rights, and they kind of send us to different polling areas and give us information. So I don't know if anyone has the correct information on what is the process to become a poll observer. And maybe that would.
Oh, sure. In Wisconsin, because we had a project on recruiting poll workers until COVID hit. And now in Wisconsin, you contact your local village or city clerks. In some states, it may be your county clerk, but you can go earlier and it should show up to find out where to go in your particular state, but it's usually a local clerk.
So Kimberly wrote there, FYI, election protection hotline. The number is there, 866-687-8683. Well, I can see that. The other thing, thank you so much, Kimberly. The other thing is that a lot of questions are about, are we going to get the slides? Are we going to get the recording? We will send this out to anyone who is registered who's here. I just saw in the earlier chat, I guess we were not able to Facebook stream it, so that's fine, but we'll probably host a watch party, and once that's up on the Women of the ELCA, we'll encourage you to host a watch party from the video that's there. This is vital information. A lot of you have written that, thank you. And we wanna make sure that we get as much information into people's hands so we can be informed voters. So you will get the information. Regina?
I did hint at something that maybe perhaps doesn't need to be hinted at, maybe just needs to be said.
Say it, girl, say it.
In the ELCA, we are dealing with a predominantly white church. Voter suppression is going to happen in a lot of predominantly Black and brown areas. Yep. If you have the opportunity to go with your Black and brown neighbor, if you must vote in person, I still believe in putting that mail-in ballot in the hands of the registrar. But if you absolutely must go to the polls, go with your Black and brown neighbor. They are less likely to be harassed with you standing there. They are less likely for you to be harassed, clergy, if you're in your cleric's garb. It's disgusting to me to have to say that, and I wrote it and took it out and wrote it and took it out again. I am asking, it happens. Of color, if you have an option in the state of California, you can vote at any poll place in your county. In California, I'm asking people, go to the county that is the blackest and brownest and vote there. But that has to do with the state that you're in. be mindful that you have an opportunity to cut down on some of the illegal, but still likely to happen voter suppression.
Yes, Amy?
One thing I'm planning to do this year is I'm taking part in an active bystander intervention training.
Yes.
And these are being conducted around the election, you know, and because we can't gather in person, I think there's more, maybe we're more aware of opportunities to take part in these trainings because so many are online. I'm doing a DC-based one, but these are going to teach skills for how to assess the situation, how to de-escalate, you know, when there is intimidation or harassment or any kind of a threat of violence. And to learn that and practice that, not just for this election, for in the future. I know there's also many, many groups that have been strategizing for months about possible election violence. And if the results of the election are not accepted in certain quarters. And so there's been a lot of scenarios and strategies and works that's taking place in local groups in your own communities.
And before we send this information out, you won't get the slides and the recording tomorrow. You'll get it sooner than later. We're also going to try to see if we have any more specific information to where you can get these kind of trainings and where you might sign up. If we can find some of the local other organizations that are doing groups training and getting folks out to the polls to do poll watching. So we'll try to get whatever more information we can included when we send you this the slides and the recording. I'm going to see here if there's any other questions. Oh, just thank you, Linda Miranda. Anyone else have any questions? If not, we're at 5:44. Can Amy what, Shirley? Hi, Shirley. So Shirley Paulson is one of the writers for that document that we wrote on Called to Be Political. So look at that. And as you see in the chat, we've been dropping in links to our resources, and we'll get those resources to you. Shirley, I'm not sure if you had a question. I'm looking to see anyone else. We're almost at the end of our time. I want to thank you all.
There is one question.
Yes. Oh, yeah, go for it.
Can Amy repeat the training, a poll?
What is the bystander training you're going to, Amy? And you're on mute, Amy.
So there's active bystander intervention training that's taking place. I'm doing it through something called the DC Peace Center. I think I'd be glad to share that information if they want a national audience. There may be groups in your communities that are doing that as well. I know the NAACP has been doing a lot of trainings and preparation in their networks. I think Friends, Societies of Friends and the Quakers and Historic Peace Churches have also been thinking about this, Church of the Brethren and others as well. And the Mennonites, yeah.
And so, yeah, if you have any information, put in the chat, or I'm gonna put my email us, and if we get it in time, we can share it with others. Because I think the more information we have, the better equipped we will be for helping everyone in this election cycle. As I said, I am Jennifer De Leon, the Director of Justice for Women of the ELCA, and so I just put my email there. So if anyone has anything that comes up, shoot me an email and I will get it. If a question comes up later that you're not sure, we'll do our best to get you the answer, because we really want to make sure that we're arming people with as much information, we're giving people as much information as possible. Sorry for the violent language. Any other question? If not, it's not, we didn't schedule, but if not, I'd like to invite someone to end this in prayer. I kind of feel that this is something that we need as we move forward doing the work that we're called to do, that we have to make sure that we keep our faith central to everything that we're doing. So I don't have any more questions. It's 4:50. It's Lisa hasn't said. Oh, thank you. Okay. Someone said check with the Poor People's Campaign for bystander training. Thank you, Valora. Anyone else have any information that I'm not seeing? I really need to get better glasses. Yeah, no, so just more links there. And I said the links will also be shared with you when we send information. Taina, can you lead us and end us in prayer? I'd like to have you come back on. Thank you. And I think this is also prayer that's in the resources that have just been created. So here's a fresh preview. Thank you.
Certainly. Let us pray. Everlasting God, source of all liberty, before whom every earthly ruler must bow and bend the knee, we lay our nation before you as we prepare for an election. Breathe upon us your spirit of wisdom and discernment. Grant all who seek public office the mind of Christ, who came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life for the freedom of the oppressed. Hold before us those who face uncertain futures, or who have no voice in our political process. Uphold and safeguard poll workers and election officials in their work. Spare us from the crushing weight of cynicism. Give us grace to speak courageously, but with love, without which our words are noise and we are nothing. Gather us together under the cross, where in all of our difference, we can stand as one people, redeemed in Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. I said you can go to our website, then our Facebook page too. We will have the recording. We will host a watch party probably sometime this week so that the recording will be up there for everyone to see, and we'll send it also to those of you who joined us. Buenas noches and God bless you. Thank you for joining us.